presentation. So the philosophical thought of Lev Tolstoy, and I think that the first thing I need to say is that Tolstoy, first and foremost, is known as a writer. His first works were tales and novels. Besides, he started to write quite late, when he was 27. And only later, he became a philosopher and started to write philosophical treatises. And this philosophical tone of Tolstoy can be tracked back to the year 1878, when the writer was hit by a severe spiritual crisis. And this crisis became a central theme of his confession, the same as in Saint Augustine, yes. And in this confession, he first of all describes different stages of his life. I mean, dissolute youth, because he was a gambler, he drank wine, he slept with a lot of women, like a young Russian aristocrat without any moral principles. Then came literary glory. He wrote War and Peace, Anna Karenina. And then came the crisis, and Tolstoy converted to Orthodoxy. Then was renunciation of Orthodoxy, and finally the discovery of true faith. So we will speak about this true faith of Tolstoy. And this is the point where Tolstoy as philosopher starts, because from that moment on, he starts to criticize everything he did before. For example, a former officer, he participated in 2 wars, condemns violence. A lover of a lot of women criticizes sex, it's natural, but he also criticizes the institute of marriage. A landlord, he was a rich man, became a harsh critic of property and money. He said that the general evil in this world is money. And even literature and art did not escape an angry word, because, as you know, the author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina said that these works are useless. It's just a lot of words and nothing more. So why did he say that? The main question which gave birth to these questions, to these problems, was the question of the meaning of life. Because it was really interesting that at the age of 50, he had everything that anybody wants to have. First of all, he had no problems with health at all. He said that I could work mentally and physically like that 10 hours straight. So he could read or write 10 hours straight without any problems. Tolstoy learned ancient Greek in 3 months, for example. Yes, so he was spiritual titan, I mean. He could work a lot. And at the same time, after War and Peace and after Anna Karenina and other stories, he didn't have problems with money and fame. He was a rich person. He invested money in real estate, so he knew how to do it and how to become richer. And also he had a faithful wife and adorable children. Tolstoy, for example, rewrite his War and Peace at least 8 times. Some episodes had like 27 items, and his wife was already writing. I mean, he was his secretary. And at the same time, Tolstoy has everything, and he is really depressed. He dreams about suicide. Yes, and this is his work. And he writes in Confession, I threw the rope out of my room because I was afraid I would hang myself, and I went hunting without a rifle. I mean, he is thinking about committing suicide. And why? Because there was only one important question. The question was, what is all this for? He understands that there is no meaning in his life. And he writes, for example, when he invested money in real estate, why am I doing this? Even if I become the richest person in the world, what is next? And he writes, I didn't know what to think about it, or I thought I could contribute to the bright future of my nation, and suddenly I asked myself, why do I need all this? And the writer's talent, I will become more famous than Shakespeare, Molière, Pushkin. And what is next? And gradually Tolstoy finds himself in a desperate situation. It's a situation of depression, and he does not want to live. He even thinks that only death can save him, but at the same time, he is afraid of death, and he does not want to die. He wants to live, but to live meaningfully, and thus the question of the meaning of life becomes the most important thing. And he understands that we cannot live nor die without having an answer to this question. And as we saw, he couldn't solve it. But one day he understood that there are millions of people who have meaningful life. And these people are not aristocrats or, for example, professors. These are ordinary peasants, ordinary workers. And why did they have meaning of life? Because they have faith. And Tolstoy concludes that there is a very strong connection between the question of the meaning of life and faith, that only faith can provide you a meaning of life. And that is why at first he started to do the same things as ordinary peasants do. I mean, he became a devoted Orthodox. He was praying, he was doing all the rituals and so on and so on, but he was the child of culture of 18th century. When Tolstoy was young, he had a portrait of Rousseau on his chest instead of the cross. So he was the child of enlightenment. And very soon his flirt or romance with the Orthodoxy ended, and he rethinks his relationship with official Christianity, but at the same time, the main idea remains the same. And that there is a connection between the meaning of life and faith. In his last work, The Pathway of Life, Путь жизни, Tolstoy wrote, in order to live right, man must know what he ought to do and what he ought not to do. In order to know this, he needs faith. Faith is the knowledge of what man is, and for that purpose he lives with the world. And such is the faith which has been and is held by all rational people. So it sounds really interesting that for Tolstoy, faith is knowledge. But it is not a knowledge about an ordinary state of affairs. It is knowledge about the life itself, how to live. And so you just need to have faith, and you will live meaningfully. The only problem is that different people have different faiths. So how can you decide which one is correct? And Tolstoy was convinced that there is only one main criteria of truth, and this criteria is happiness. In general, I think that he understood happiness in a very ancient way as all good things you can have. In Latin, it is summum bonum or something like that. I don't remember exactly the phrase. So, and he speculates about this question in his work о жизни, about life. So the main question is there a meaning in my life that could be death? And the main statement of this book sounds almost like a classical syllogism. If individual isn't happy, he does not want to live. So for Tolstoy, pursuit of happiness and happiness is the same as life. Thus, word жизнь, life, in Tolstoy's philosophy is not a blind act of living. It always means a meaningful and happy life. So the only question now, if we can say that happiness and life is the same, we can only ask, okay, what is happiness then? And he describes different understandings of happiness. And first one is that in the state of primitive life, it seems that happiness is the satisfaction of all desires. But we all are philosophers, so we know that if a person begins to think rationally, he understands that it is impossible to satisfy all desires. And those which are satisfied, and joy of those which are satisfied is corrupted by death. Because you know that I can do anything I want to, but at the end of the day, I will be dead. So he asks, is there a meaning in my life that could be death? And he answers, yes, there is. But the meaning of my life has nothing in common with egoistic desires. If one wants to live his life meaningfully, he needs to start to live in a different way. And only this way, he will understand that life is a real joy. So this is his commandment, what we should do in this and how we should understand our life. Rejoice, rejoice. The work of life, its purpose is joy. Rejoice at the sky, at the sun, at the stars, at the grass, at the trees, at the animals, at the people, and make sure that this joy is not disturbed by anything. If this joy is violated, then you have made a mistake somewhere. Look for this mistake and correct it. Be like children, always rejoice. And we see that life should be a joy. But if one wants his life to be a joy, says Tolstoy, he needs to love everyone. Why? And I think that he's quite scholastic in this place, because he says that the only thing which ruins our joy is death. And you cannot be happy when you know that death exists. So Tolstoy says you need to be attached to a thing which does not die. And it can be your mother, brother, or particular people, because everyone dies. You also will die someday. And he says, so you need to love humanity. You need to love everybody, because humanity as such does not die. And in this case, if you will be able to love humanity, you will be happy. And you will feel that special bliss and happiness. And when he tries to describe this happiness and to prove us that it is not just a product of his fantasy, he reminds us about our childhood. Because it's a very long quotation, but there was, and there is, a very good researcher of Tolstoy, Pavel Basinski, and he says that in general we can understand Tolstoy as a child who became a writer and philosopher. So experience of childhood is really important for Tolstoy. And for example, there is long quotation. Where is the living man who does not know this feeling of bliss by having experienced it at least once, and most frequently in his early childhood, before his soul was obstructed by all the deceitful doctrines which stifle life in us? This feeling of happiness and gentleness, which makes us wish to love all neighbors, father, mother, brother, bad people and enemies, and the dog and the horse and the blade of grass, which makes us desire but one thing, that it should be well with all, that all should be happy, and still more desire to act so that it would be well with all, to sacrifice ourselves and our whole life in order that all may be happy and contented is alone love. And in this only is the life of man. So he says that we can remember our childhood if we want to understand what is that real feeling of love. Because yes, we all experienced love as a romantic love. And besides, we have our, mother, brother, and so on. But nevertheless, the problem is why people who are in love are not happy. And after all, as Vladimir Solovyov said, for example, there is so-called collective egoism, when we love our family or our nation, but we still hate other people. Nevertheless, Tolstoy said even stronger, we cannot love people who we don't know. So it's impossible even to love our nation, what to speak about humanity. And so maybe there is another kind of love, and Tolstoy says, yes, there is. Because there is God. And if you love God, you love everybody, because everybody lies in hand of this God. God is the basis of love. He is the center of the circle, and you can meet in God everybody. So that's how he solved this problem that it is impossible to love humanity. Instead of humanity, you need to love God, and only then you will love everybody. And now we can speak about his understanding of God, because it is the center of his philosophy, especially his metaphysics. And Tolstoy often spoke of God, but avoided giving a definition, because it's impossible to define infinity. But he spoke about his experience of God and its interpretations. That's, for example, he wrote to Matvei Chestikov, I do not acknowledge anything but God. God is infinity of which I am a part, and this is not a phrase at all, but what I live by. Even before his death, he was only thinking about what is God. But now, I think it's important to say that it was very strange understanding of God. First of all, it wasn't a Christian conception. It is not a Holy Trinity, because Tolstoy, in his, at least in his theological treatises, considered Christ only as a prophet, not as a God. And he was convinced that already Saint Paul distorted the teaching of Christ. And that's why he decided to retranslate Gospels. As I said, he learned ancient Greek in 3 months, and he did a translation, but it was done in a manner of liberal theology. All the miracles were cast out, and moral teaching were underlined. So a little bit later, he wrote a book, Краткое изложение 4 Евангелий, the Gospel in brief. I wouldn't call it even a translation, because it's like a compilation of all the 4 Gospels. But to be honest, I like it as a book, not as a Gospel, because it was written in a very strong and simple manner. And this Gospel in brief influenced a lot of people. For example, Wittgenstein said that this book saved his life. He was writing to his friend, are you acquainted with Tolstoy, The Gospel in Brief? At its time, this book virtually kept me alive. If you are not acquainted with it, then you cannot imagine what an effect it can have upon a person. Yes, and I think that Tolstoy was a writer, because from the theological point of view, he just said that the most important thing is morality. And he didn't consider Christianity as a religion with hell, paradise, or miracles, because he said there's only one reality, God, and God penetrates everything. I don't know if you acknowledged with, if you know this book of Aldous Huxley, the philosophy perennis, or something like that, yes. But there are a lot of common ideas between Tolstoy and Huxley, for example, that you are the same as God is, and so on, so on. So, in general, Tolstoy's philosophy stands very close to the Far East religions. But at the same time, sometimes he says things with which every Christian could agree. For example, there is a quote about how we understand God. We know God less by our reason than by our feeling, akin to that of an infant in his mother's arms. The infant does not know who is holding him, keeping him warm, feeding him, but knows that someone is doing it, and moreover, he not only knows that one in whose power he is, but loves her. Even so, it is with man. So there is some irrational understanding of God in our life, and we feel it. The most important thing here that still there is a man in Tolstoy's philosophy. It is not a pantheism, because Tolstoy often was accused of pantheism. And he said, no, I think that a man has a freedom. The only question is, how can we understand who is a man if we say, if Tolstoy says that God penetrates everything? And he was emphasizing two things. First of all, a man is not a body, because when you think that I am the body, it is the root of all suffering. Because body longs for money, fame, and pleasures. And as it was said before, when the desires of body are satisfied, it becomes bored. When they are not satisfied, it suffers. And besides, he says a really interesting thing. He says that we better know our soul than our body. When I think about it, it is more difficult for me to understand what my body is than what my soul is. And close as it is to me, the body is something foreign. It is the soul that is mine. And after all, body has a past and a future, while the soul is rooted in eternity, and it has only one aim, to become one with God. And Tolstoy quotes an Indian thought: a drop of water entering the ocean becomes the ocean. The soul uniting with God becomes God. As it was said before, the only way to become God is to fight egoism within yourself. And at this point, a lot of researchers conclude that Tolstoy didn't acknowledge the freedom of personality, that Tolstoy was pantheist. And nevertheless, for me, there is a question. Did Tolstoy think that an individual personality is an illusion? And I don't think so. I think that his doctrine of this relationship between man and God can be described in a following way. I think we all remember the famous metaphor of Plotinus about tree and leaves. Humans are leaves of one tree, that are different from the trunk or roots. And on the one hand, it seems that every leaf has its own life. But on the other hand, they all are the same tree because everything is united by the same force of life. So this connection, even between leaves on the tree and the very tree, stands a little bit beyond logic. And the same can be said about Tolstoy's understanding of connection between man and God. It stands beyond logic, and it implies at the same time that God is everything, and at the same time that we are free. And moreover, Tolstoy didn't like pantheism because he said pantheism has dangerous elements of materialism. Pantheism means that body and matter are deified, and it means that there is no difference between good and evil. And so it's impossible to say that Tolstoy was totally influenced only by Far East religions like Taoism or Brahmanism. He was also influenced by Bible, and he often uses a very biblical metaphor of relationship between man and God as a relationship between master and worker. There is his brilliant late novel, Tale, Master and Worker, and when he writes about it, he explains one of the most interesting things. As for me, this thought of Tolstoy is very important. Once he said that when I was looking for the meaning of my life, I couldn't find it. And only later I understood that I can't find it because I had meaningful life. So he said that at first you need to live meaningfully, and only then you will understand and find the meaning of life. So at first comes practice, and only then comes understanding. You cannot live as, for example, Tolstoy lived, while killing other people in the war, having sex with a lot of women, gambling, drinking wine, and at the same time to be in the search and to find a meaning of life. He says we need to do as religion says to us, and understanding will come later. And there is following example. It's a very long quote, but I really like it, where he explains how it works. The translation of this is from his confession, was made at the beginning of 20th century, so maybe the English we see there is a little bit difficult, but nevertheless I will try to read it, because there are a lot of words which we don't use anymore in English. If a naked, hungry beggar has been taken from the crossroads, brought into a building belonging to a beautiful establishment, fed, supplied with drink, and obliged to move a handle up and down, evidently, before discussing why he was taken, why he should move the handle, and whether the whole establishment is reasonably arranged, the beggar should first of all move the handle. If he moves the handle, he will understand that it works a pump, that the pump draws water, and that the water irrigates the garden beds. Then he will be taken from the pumping station to another place where he will gather fruits and will enter into the joy of his master, and passing from the lower to higher work will understand more and more of the arrangements of the establishment, and taking part in it will never think of asking why he is there and will certainly not reproach the master. I think everybody knows this, that sometimes we can understand the meaning of work or how we need to do it only when we are doing it. And for Tolstoy, it is the same. He says practice comes first. Only by doing something we can understand the meaning of it. And that is why at first we need to do as true religion says to us, and everything will be fine. So now we can speak about the practical side of Tolstoy's philosophy, which, to be honest, is very short, but very important. He says you need to do just two things: love your neighbor and do good deeds, nothing more. But yes, there is a picture. It is a book. It is written in Russian. Елена Милешко, Христианская этика Толстого, about Christian ethic of Tolstoy. I think it should be translated into English because it may be one of the best books where the whole ethic of Tolstoy is analyzed, and it's just a big research. But so I will use sometimes the thoughts of Mileshko. And the center of ethics of Tolstoy is love. And he writes, "It is customary for man to love as it is for a flower to bloom and for a bee to fly. This means that any deviation from the law of love makes person unhappy. And that is why, according to Tolstoy, the first and foremost condition of true love is not to harm anyone and not to to multiply evil by resisting it by force." So now we can speak about maybe the most famous part of Tolstoy's philosophy, the so-called Doctrine of Non-Violence, which influenced even Gandhi. At first, I would like to read you a prayer, which I find in a book of Antony Sursky. This prayer was found by Andreas Moore at the Buchenwald crematorium, and it was probably written in a women's concentration camp in Ravensbrück. So the problem is that it was written in German. Yes. Antony Sursky provided it in Russian, so I will read you my translation. Peace to all people of ill will. May all calls for revenge, punishment, and retribution cease. Crimes have overflowed from the cup, and the human mind is no longer able to accommodate them. The hosts of martyrs are innumerable. Therefore, do not place their suffering on the scales of your justice. Lord, do not turn them over to the torturers with a grave accusation to exact a terrible retribution against them. Repay them differently. So, in short, this probably woman asks God not to revenge Nazis, not to revenge these people, and she asks that instead of the sins of the executioners, the Lord put the tears, hope, courage, and the broken hearts of their victims on the scales of his justice, and that the suffering of all martyrs be ended, so that there will be no longer violence in the world, and so that peace may return to the earth. In general, yes, she asks the same thing as Tolstoy was saying about. She says that we should not multiply evil by killing these Nazis or doing something like that. And this is the central idea of Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy. And he says that the commandment not to resist evil by force is the fundamental truth of eternal philosophy that all the greatest teachers of humankind were written about. But it was perfectly expressed in the gospel. This is the place to which Tolstoy appeals. You have knowledge that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not make use of force against an evil man, but to him who gives you a blow on the right side of your face, let the left be turned. It is important to know that Christ often said, have love for those who are against you, but clearly gave the negative commandment. I mean, there is a negative commandment. Do not make use of force against an evil man only once. This is the only place in Gospel which says about non-violence. However, for Tolstoy, it was the most important place. At first, he viewed this commandment of Christ as one of the 5 basic rules of Christianity. Do not make use of force against an evil man. Do not fight. Do not be angry. Do not commit adultery. Do not swear. But already in his work, My Religion, Tolstoy begins to look at this commandment as a fundamental principle of Christianity and radicalizes it. Resist no evil means never resist, never oppose violence, or in other words, never do anything contrary to the law of love. If anyone takes advantage of this disposition and affronts you, bear the affront and do not, above all, have recourse to violence. So there is a commandment not to use violence, never. This is one of the basic conditions of love. And it says that people should not consider themselves as the highest value in the world, which means that non-violence requires sacrifice, because you need to sacrifice yourself if there is a conflict and you cannot do anything to the abuser. It's a real act of self-sacrifice. And now we have even a more strange thought of Tolstoy, because the doctrine of non-violence wasn't the only a doctrine of personal ethics. You can say that you, as one person, can do this. But I don't know if you, in Lithuania, we really like Emmanuel Levinas, a philosopher, because he was from Lithuania. And he often spoke about the problem of ethics, that if there are 2 people, you should do anything to other person. You should sacrifice. But if there are 3 people, yes, such ethics does not work, because maybe you have children. So how can you sacrifice your life? What will do with your children? But Tolstoy is very radical. So the conception of non-violence became even the central to his social philosophy. Tolstoy shows in this book, the kingdom of God is within you, how hard people try to make themselves unhappy. Courts and prisons only increase crime. During the wars, millions of people die. And even if there is no war, army still deprives the healthiest members of society. So these people know only how to kill other people. And so on, so on. This is a madness, and Tolstoy says that this madness can be healed only in one way, the way of non-violence. So, according to Tolstoy, the social position of a person must be as follows. Not committing any coercion on your own means that nobody can be beaten or killed. One cannot participate in the coercive mechanism. Be a civil servant, a judge, a tax collector, soldier, and so on. So, for him, these professions, I mean, judge or tax collector, is the professions of evil. And in no circumstances can you express one's consent to coercive activities. And then he says that if only everyone started living like this, there would be almost no violence in the world. Yes, I can agree with that. But it looks like a miracle, and that's why the critics of the doctrine of non-violence said that it's impractical, it is detached from everyday life. Nobody can live like this. And they even had this very famous mental experiment. A man living on a farm, a lonely man, sees how mentally ill person, it's important, wants to rape his daughter. So does he have right to use violence against an insane person? Why they say mentally ill person? Because In this case, Tolstoy couldn't answer that we should talk with this person, change him with our words, and so on and so on, because maybe this person does not understand us at all. And it seems, yes, we can use violence. We can put such people in jail to create a safe society, but Tolstoy says no. Tolstoy says no, we do not have to put such people in jail. Instead, we have to try to change them. And now is one of the most radical thoughts of Tolstoy. He says that even if they continue with their killings, it is not really very scary. Yes. An insane man can kill me, you, my daughter, your mother. Why should that be so terrible? We will all die anyway, and we must therefore not do evil to stop ourselves from dying. It's a very radical thought. And I want to explain it a little bit. First of all, this radicalism based on following reasoning. If it is decided that an insane person can be imprisoned, then one can be imprisoned if he or she is only suspected of being mad, which gives the government the right to imprison anybody. So this is one of Tolstoy's favorite counter-arguments to his critiques. If we approve on the theoretical level the using of violence against someone, we are in fact allowing to use violence against everyone. For example, if we say violence can be used in self-defense, then everybody who uses violence will claim that I'm using it in self-defense. And now we can understand why he wrote such a cruel words. He says that no compromise can be made within the sphere of theory. In practice, compromise will inevitably be used for justification, and therefore we cannot allow it in theory. Because if we allow justification of violence in theory, we do our practical life even more worse. And Lev Tolstoy wasn't a crazy man. He was convinced that it's impossible to carry out the doctrine of non-violence perfectly, but we still need to try it, to do it. Christ knew that complete perfection will never be attained, but the pursuit of complete, infinite perfection will continually increase human happiness, and this happiness may be increased to infinity. So Tolstoy says that it's impossible to do, but we need to try to do it, and it will make us happy. Why he thought so? Because some people think that if there are two people, one a follower of Tolstoy and another one just an ordinary person who has nothing against violence, so this follower of Tolstoy is doomed to lose. To be honest, the history showed us that it is true. During the Soviet times, all the communes of Толстовцы had a very sad doom. Almost everybody were killed, and the separate were imprisoned in gulags. So the Soviet system wasn't very fond of Толстовцы. So can we say that these people were happy? In some way, yes. A few who survived said that they were really happy. And Tolstoy also was claiming that it is not the results of your life which makes you happy, but the very path of your life. And Abdussalam Gusseinov, he draws the following analogy. Anyone who says he would like to follow this teaching but is afraid to ruin his life simply does not understand what is going on. It can be compared to this situation. People on the shore see a drowning man. They throw a rope toward him, but the man, instead of saving his life, says that he is not going to do that until everyone does the same. So you need to use this doctrine of non-violence as the rope, and it is not important what is going next. And according to Tolstoy, the doctrine of non-violence is not a tool which should change a society, but a path that makes a person happy, and peaceful and harmonious society is only a consequence of this way of life. And these are words of Tolstoy. Do your work, improve and enhance your soul, and be sure that only in this way will you contribute to the improvement of social life. So I think that at this point, general traits of doctrine of non-violence became more clear. And so let me to conclude this part with the words of Lev Tolstoy, which were written in the year 1806 about non-violence. It need not be said that the doctrine of non-resistance is the most terrible and the most irrational and mysterious thing that we read in the Gospel. All our reasoning soul is indignant at the thought that full material freedom should be given to the murderer to accomplish his murderous acts. How can you allow a murderer to kill an innocent child before your very eyes and yet not draw the sword? Who has the right to give that abominable precept? Only Tolstoy boldly and resolutely tries to test the truth of the Christian teaching, not in his thoughts alone, but in part of his life also. I think, to be honest, that Tolstoy is totally right. And it helps us to understand in a different light the teaching of Tolstoy. Tolstoy often was accused of creating a universal ideology, so totalitarian system of philosophy. But I don't think so. I think that first and foremost, it was his personal project. He tried to improve his own soul, and for such a person as Tolstoy, it was impossible to write. And these writings were not recipes. They were just his own searches of truth. And I think that these books should inspire us to find our own way. These thoughts I am saying right now were already said by Bunin. Bunin wrote his very famous recollections about Tolstoy. And he always underlines that Tolstoy wasn't a universal teacher like a new Marx or Lenin. And Tolstoy didn't like, for example, Tolstovцы, that is his disciples. When Tolstoy left his house, he was ready to go anywhere except to the Tolstovцы, because he was convinced that a spiritual life is a very personal matter. And there is no teachers and doctrines, and there is only one ideal of love, but we need to find our own way. And this is what Bunin writes a lot. So personally, I think that Tolstoy used his own text as mirrors to improve his soul, and we can see it from his life. But the problem is that the life of Tolstoy is a very big topic, so it is impossible to discuss it today. And at this moment, I think that this is all. Thank you.